Tonight, the debate over the future of American healthcare takes center stage as economist Douglas Holtz-Eakin delivers a sharp critique of the Affordable Care Act before Congress. Holtz-Eakin argues the ACA remains fundamentally flawed, driving up insurance costs, weakening employer-based coverage, and worsening long-term federal deficits. With the 2026 plan year already locked in, he warns lawmakers that short-term fixes are limited and calls instead for a major overhaul of federal health policy, including a rethinking of subsidies and stronger incentives for high-value care. His testimony sets the stage for a broader battle over health care, labor markets, and the federal budget.
Dr. Holtz-Eakin.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wyden, members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of being here today. In my testimony, I wanted to make three basic points. Point number one is that the ACA was and remains a flawed policy construct from several perspectives. As an insurance market, it's overly rigidly regulated, making it very difficult to manage the costs in that market, and it has proven to be a very high-cost location for insurance. From the perspective of economic policy, it has some highly detrimental labor market incentives, both for the employers with the pay-or-play provisions, the taxes that were originally levied there, and for the workers themselves, where there's no tie between work and health insurance, as there is with employer-sponsored insurance, which is a very important thing in America, to support work in every way that we can. And from the outset, the subsidies were so generous that you could do the math and figure out that up to 300% of poverty, it made a lot of sense for employers to just stop being in the insurance business, put their workers in the exchanges, and both the worker and the employer could come out ahead. And so those incentives were there at the beginning, and they have not been changed. They remain. They are a headwind to ESI in America, and to continue them and exacerbate them, I think, is unwise. And Senator Johnson is one of the people who did the original calculations on this back at the launch of the ACA. And from a fiscal perspective at the time, I was quite worried about the implications for the budgetary outlook, which were not good then and are even worse now. And to add any further additional mandatory spending to the federal budget is simply unwise at this point and must be offset at a minimum or find another way to meet that objective. So as a piece of health policy, economic policy, and budget policy, the ACA has always been a troubling construct. Point number two is that from the perspective of the 2026 plan year, the plans have been designed, the premiums have been set, many people have already enrolled and made their selections. There's very little that this Congress can do to change the outlook. There are some channels by which you could get additional dollars to those participants in the ACA market. I'm happy to discuss those with you, but you can't do much to the fundamental working of the market at this point. Past 2026, within the constructs of the ACA, there are some options on HSAs, FSAs, and other things that I'd be happy to discuss with you. They would be welcome changes, I think, and improvements in the ACA, but they don't change fundamentally the problems that we face in the healthcare area. And so point number three is we are overdue for a real rethinking of healthcare policy at the federal level. And I think there should be two primary objectives. The first objective would be to rationalize the insurance subsidies. We subsidize essentially every piece of health insurance in the economy. Employer-sponsored insurance is subsidized through the tax code, through the non-taxation of it. We have the ACA subsidies, we have Medicaid, we have Medicare. All of these are on the taxpayer, and they sometimes compete with one another. The ACA is just in competition with the ESI, and wherever the subsidies richer people can migrate. A rational set of subsidies that make sense from the perspective of the federal budget outlook and the needs in insurance markets, it would be a welcome change from where we are right now. The second major objective is to get better incentives across the board for high value care. It remains an objective that wasn't pursued very hard in the ACA. At the time, there was that we're going to cover everyone or bend the cost curve, and the ACA was about covering everyone, very little about bending the cost curve. We need to revisit that discussion, and in my testimony, I suggested that a great vehicle for you to think about improving those incentives is Medicare Advantage in particular. That's the place where the majority of Medicare beneficiaries are. It has the greatest opportunity to influence practice patterns in the United States, and Medicare is a great budgetary threat. And so I encourage the committee and the Congress as a whole to take a hard look at that and make some progress toward better health care outcomes and better budgetary outcomes. Thank you. Look forward to answering your questions.
Douglas Holtz-Eakin's testimony is best understood as a systemic critique, not a narrow policy disagreement. He frames the Affordable Care Act as problematic across three dimensions: health insurance markets, labor markets, and federal fiscal policy, and argues those problems have not only persisted but intensified over time. 1. ACA as a flawed insurance market. Holtz-Eakin's first and most forceful argument is that the ACA marketplace is overregulated and structurally expensive. He suggests that rigid benefit requirements and regulatory constraints make cost management extremely difficult for insurers. The result, in his view, is predictable: higher premiums and limited flexibility, especially compared to employer-sponsored insurance, ESI. Importantly, he does not argue that the ACA failed to expand coverage, but rather that it did so at excessive and unsustainable cost, creating a market that depends heavily on federal subsidies rather than efficient pricing. 2. Labor market distortions and employer incentives. A central theme of his testimony is that the ACA undermines employer-sponsored insurance, which he views as a cornerstone of the American labor market. Holtz-Eakin highlights two distortions. Employers face incentives to exit the insurance business entirely, pushing workers into ACA exchanges. Workers, especially up to 300% of the federal poverty level, can be financially better off outside employer coverage due to generous subsidies. He emphasizes that these incentives were known at the ACA's launch and remain unchanged. In his framing, this creates a long-term headwind against ESI, weakening the traditional link between work and health insurance, something he argues is economically and culturally important in the U.S. 3. Budgetary and fiscal concerns. From a fiscal standpoint, Holtz-Eakin delivers a stark warning: additional mandatory spending tied to ACA subsidies is irresponsible without offsets. He argues that ACA subsidies were costly at inception. The federal budget outlook is significantly worse today. Expanding subsidies without structural reform worsens long-term debt risks. This positions his critique squarely within broader deficit and entitlement reform debates, rather than just health policy. 4. Limited options for 2026 and beyond. Holtz-Eakin acknowledges a political reality: for the 2026 plan year, Congress has very limited room to maneuver. Plans are set, premiums are priced, and many enrollees have already made choices. While he notes Congress could funnel additional dollars to participants, he argues these would be band-aid solutions, not structural fixes. Looking past 2026, he expresses openness to incremental reforms, such as expanding HSAs and FSAs, but is clear that these do not solve the deeper issues of cost growth and distorted incentives. 5. Call for a broader health policy reset. The most forward-looking part of Holtz-Eakin's testimony is his call for a fundamental rethinking of federal health care policy, centered on two objectives. 8. Rationalizing insurance subsidies. He argues the U.S. currently subsidizes every major form of insurance: ESI, ACA plans, Medicaid, and Medicare, often in ways that compete with one another. This creates inefficiencies and encourages people to move toward whichever subsidy is richest, rather than what is most economically efficient. A unified, rational subsidy framework, he suggests, would improve both market stability and fiscal sustainability. B. Incentivizing high-value care. Holtz-Eakin criticizes the ACA for prioritizing coverage expansion over cost containment and value-based care. He argues that bending the cost curve was largely sidelined. He identifies Medicare, particularly Medicare Advantage, as the most powerful lever for reform, given its scale and influence on provider behavior. Because Medicare is also one of the largest long-term threats to the federal budget, he sees reform here as offering both better health outcomes and better fiscal outcomes. Bottom line: Holtz-Eakin's testimony is not a call for repeal, it's a call for structural realignment. He argues that without addressing distorted incentives, fragmented subsidies, and runaway entitlement spending, the the U.S. will continue to pay more for health care without improving outcomes. For lawmakers, his message is clear: incremental spending fixes may buy time, but they won't fix the system.